Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I am the manager of visitor experience at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Welcome back to all the familiar faces that we've seen so many times before. This virtual series features programs on Pennsylvania transit, history topics, stories about the trolley era, the museum's collection that you can experience from home, usually on a Tuesday or a Wednesday night. We're going to continue these as long as we have presenters. So if you have a program that fits our mission, the trolley era, stories of Pennsylvania transit, or cities where our streetcars come from, please reach out because I'm still looking for presenters. And if you have a program that doesn't quite fit those guidelines, feel free to reach out anyway. Occasionally, we do host some other programs as well. I haven't had a chance to put any of the other upcoming programs on our website yet, but when I do, you can see those at patrolley.org. Okay, and I want to extend a very special thank you to those of you who donated while registering for tonight's program, or those of you who have made a donation through our website this year. We really, really appreciate your support of our virtual programs. Okay, brief introduction to the museum. We were established in 1954 as the Arden Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And we opened to visitors a few years later in 1963, and we're located along the former interurban route between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. Here you'll find over 50 trolleys and electric railway cars. About a little over 20 of them operate. And last year we had 48,000 visitors take our 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. So now I'm going to give you guys some very exciting updates. This one we've been keeping under wraps, but this week, August 12th, the terrible trolley, car 1713, rolled out just 2 years after we got it in May of 2023. So we had a big party last week. And this PCC is now in operation. If you're not familiar, it's a Steelers-themed trolley, and we have the permissions from the NFL and the Steelers to have their logo and everything on here and to use the word terrible. You can actually buy a terrible trolley towel officially licensed in our gift shop. And it was super exciting. Last week, we had some of the Steelerettes, which were the NFL's first cheerleading team. They were out from the 1960s. I think you could probably see a couple of them maybe in the photo there. And then we had a couple of the Super Steelers era football players come out as well. So the car is beautiful. Micah Bukta was our project manager. He did an amazing job. Here's a couple more photos. The terrible trolley you can see on the back part of the car. All those little numbers on the black part are the players' numbers who were on the teams then. And then it says Super Bowl champs, and then the Roman numerals there. At this point in time, when the car was painted, 1980, the Steelers had won 4 Super Bowls, actually 3 when it was painted, and then they won the 4th right after this was painted. So that's why it doesn't have all 6 for any diehard Steelers fans. And then the 14 on the front is just before Super Bowl 14. So this car is running pretty much all the time because everyone keeps asking about it, and it's very exciting. So come check it out. We already had a little night photo shoot with it, and we'll be releasing more photos soon. The other interesting thing coming up here that you guys might also be interested in, October 4th, we're having a farewell ride on Cleveland's rail fleet. So one of our volunteers, Alex Bruchak, is setting this up, and it's going to be run through the museum. And it's pretty rare for Cleveland's RTA to do an excursion or a fan trip. So we're very lucky. They're going to be retiring a lot of these vehicles in the next year. So from what I understand, they're going to be kind of standardizing their fleet. So this might be your last chance to ride on some of these types of cars. The tickets are $75 at patrolley.org/Cleveland-farewell. So I'll put a link to that in the chat so you guys can click on it a little bit later. Okay, and now without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Harry Garforth. Raised in the Roxborough section of Philadelphia in a transit-dependent family, Harry became familiar with Philadelphia's extensive network of public transit routes. An appreciation for the transportation history of numerous private carriers resulted. After graduating college in 1975, Harry began a career at the local public transit agency, SEPTA, starting as a bus operator. He quickly rose to the positions in scheduling, planning, and finally management, and he retired at the position of manager, regional rail planning and scheduling after 37 years. A second career began immediately afterward with a 7-year stint at Amtrak, retiring as director of Northeast Corridor Service Planning. In retirement a second time, Harry has turned to writing about transportation history with one of his latest collaborative efforts covering Frankfurt's Elevated Railway and its predecessors. The next project was a comprehensive history of the Reading Company's Blue Liner and Mew cars, and expected to be published later this year is the history of the SEPTA Railworks project and a follow-up to his first book, Rails Through Manayunk. All right, at the end of this presentation, we will have a question and answer session, but the chat box is going to be open throughout, so please feel free to enter questions and comments during the show, and we can read through those at the end. And this program is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube at some point within the next couple months. And at this time, I'm going to ask everybody to turn off their videos just so we don't have any distractions, and I will invite you to turn those back on at the end. So don't be offended if I come along and turn it off. All right, Harry, if you are ready, take it away.
All right, I'm going to click the share button. All right, can everybody see the cover of the book?
Looks good.
All right. So thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. And thank you for welcoming me back for the part 2 of this program. As I did the last time, I wanted to bring everybody's attention to the fact that there was a book prepared to cover this subject matter to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Frankford Elevated back in 2022. At the end of the program, I will have information on where you can secure copies of the book. It goes into the subject matter that we will cover tonight, plus what we covered in part 1 in greater depth. And I think you'll all find it very interesting. It has 167 pages and a similar number of images that were obtained from various sources. Some of them were glass plate negatives, and a lot of them had not seen the light of day in many, many years. So hopefully it's something you'll consider, with the proceeds going to the Historical Society of Frankfurt. So before we get started on part 2, I wanted to go back and answer some of the questions that were posed in part 1. And if you let me beg your patience here, because a couple of the parties did ask very good questions, which I could not answer, but I'd have them tonight. The first question was, what was the clearance provided underneath the elevated structure to allow for freight train operation? The answer was 21 feet above steam railroad crossings in operation and 14 feet above street traffic. Question 2 was, did the Frankfurt cars operate on the Delaware Avenue Elevated? And Mr. Wright helped me out with this answer. From what we can gather, it appears not. The sharp radius of the curve of the 100-degree curve to reach Delaware Avenue off of Front Street likely precluded that operation. The Market Street cars that operated over that alignment starting in 1908 were 34 feet 6 inches between the bolsters and 49 feet 7 inches long. The Frankfurt cars were 38 feet between the bolsters and 55 feet long. So they were a little bit longer, especially between the bolsters. The Market Street cars were also lighter at 71,000 pounds, where the Frankfurt cars were 89,500 pounds. And finally, the last factor was the city of Philadelphia funded the purchase of the Frankfurt cars with the full intent of operating on the new elevated to Frankfurt. So they were likely taking the position that they should continue to operate just to serve the Frankfurt elevated. And sometimes things can happen, but I think the other two factors considered precluded the operation of those cars down there. Again, that's what we've been able to uncover. I've never seen photographic evidence of any Frankfurt cars down there, but you just never know. But from what I can gather, it doesn't appear so. Question 3 was a question that I posed during the program, and George Gula came forward with some answers even during the program, which I appreciated. But I did some further research and we expanded on what George had said. The car was fabricated using, so what was the question? The question was, what happened to the horse car that was renovated for the opening of the Frankfurt Elevated, car 13? Well, the answer is the car was fabricated using a sand car S33 with an authentic horse car body, but the wheels and axles were fabricated using components of a Peckham truck. The number 13 was chosen because it was Mitten's lucky number, and the car was stored until 1925 and then scrapped. That information came from Utility Cars of Philadelphia by Harold Cox, published in 1971, at least the third version. So now, let's get into Frankfurt's Elevated Railway, Part 2, 100 Years of Service. Just before I kick off, I wanted to again express the appreciation and recognition to the following organizations for the provision of material for the program tonight and Part 1 and for the book. That includes the Historical Society of Frankfurt, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Special Collections Research Center at Temple University, the Free Library of Philadelphia, PhiladelphiaHistory.org, Electric City Trolley Museum, and individual members of the National Railway Historical Society and the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. I offered this map. It was very timely when we did Part 1. They had just changed over the nomenclature for the Market Frankfurt line to Route L on February 23rd, 2025. I added in the Broad Street line, which, now you got B1, 2, and 3 for the Broad Street line to figure out which route you're riding. But tonight, we're just going to focus on the area in the red box, which is between Spring Garden Street and the Frankfurt Transportation Center. So starting in November 1922, the Frankfurt Elevated and the Bustleton Trolley line are completed. A week-long celebration ensued. Service began and 100 years of operations followed. Feeder routes were upgraded, new equipment arrives, and time to rebuild the structure and the Bridge Pratt Terminal arrived, so we'll be talking about that tonight. So just to overlap the Part 1, this is the celebration of the completion of the Frankfurt Elevated and the celebration of the cessation of disruption that the project caused, because through Frankfurt, it was working as early as 1917, and it wasn't completed until 1922. And of course, in that picture on the right, hats were not optional. Here's the car 13 that we discussed. It was in the Part 1 program, and there's a pretty good picture of it. It's a shame that that car wasn't saved. Speaking of horse cars, I stumbled upon a horse car guide doing some research at the Historic Society of Newtown, and I was surprised to see where that red area is that they showed a horse car operation on the streets of Oxford, Harrison, and Frankfurt Avenue. That has since been called into question. I was told sometimes these guides weren't 100% accurate, but we're now trying to track down if there was ever track laid down in that triangle. Up at Bridge Street, the great celebration was ready to kick off the service of the Frankfurt Elevated. You can see there's Mayor Moore standing on the speaker's podium, as well as inspecting the new Frankfurt cars on the left. And you can see the throng of people that came out to listen to the speeches that were given on November 4th, 1922. We talked about I'm just going to hold on for a second. I'm going to close my window. Sorry about that. Some people like to cut their grass late at night. So in this particular slide, we're looking at the bronze dedication plaque placed in Bridge Street Terminal Building. This plaque was taken down during the Frankfurt Transportation Center work and stored. We don't know where it is today, unfortunately. On the right, we have a picture of the Route 59 Bernie car posed on Oxford Avenue. And it's an early example of photoshopping. Henniker's studio was just to the right where this trolley was posed, and they superimposed the dummy depot behind the trolley car. It was torn down for the elevated construction. So photoshopping in 1922. Here you can see the facilities are all ready for the first day of service. There's the bridge platform with a single individual standing solitary next to the slow sign. There's the new cars positioned on the platform waiting for the passengers to board. This is how Bridge Street looked before the elevated arrived in 1918. You can see there's nothing but trolleys. And what you can barely make out is the elevated structure is in the middle of the photograph. The construction stopped at Dyer Street on Frankford Avenue in 1917. And so it took 5 years to complete the project. And you've got the result on the right. And then that car, it's circled in red. It was a special car that brought up the speakers to the engagement for that day. So 100 years of Frankford Elevated and the Bustleton Trolley, Route 59, and Route 66. Why, you would say, are we talking about Route 66? Well, if you recall back in part one, it was originally proposed to build the Frankford Elevated as far as Braun Street. So that's another 3 or so miles north of Bridge Street. That never happened. So Route 66 had to pick up the slack and become a big trunk feeder route into the Market Frankfurt line. And so I thought it would be appropriate to include it in the program tonight. So starting back in 1926, we're doing the 100 years of operation now. The Delaware River Bridge opens, and we're going to talk about how important that was and how it had an impact on the Frankfurt Elevated. Also in 1926, speaking about Route 66, the PRT acquired the Hop Toad and Frog, which is the Holmesburg, Tacony, and Frankfurt, or it was reorganized to the Frankfurt, Tacony, and no, it was reversed. But anyway, the Hop Toad and Frog was acquired in 1926. In 1928, on Route 59, we'll learn about how the original cars, which were Birney cars that only sat 33 passengers, were insufficient to handle the passenger loads, and they were replaced. In 1936, the Camden Bridge line opens, and that had an impact on the Delaware Avenue Elevated, which closed 3 years later. In 1940, PTC was created. In 1948, there were a lot of changes made at Arrett Street, and we'll talk about those in detail. Moving forward into the 50s, trackless started to be introduced on several routes. On Route 59, it occurred with Marmon Harrington TC46 coaches. 1952, there were changes made up at the Breach Pratt station with the addition of a lateral platform. 1955, larger Marmon Harringtons were bought, TC49s for Route 66. In 1960, the new Bud-built Market Frankfurt cars came with ventilation fans, and we talked about that in part one, where the ventilation fans were originally intended to be installed in the Frankfurt cars, but that never happened. In 1964, SEPTA was created to absorb PTC and others. 1977, there was a major construction project for I-95 just north of the city of Philadelphia, which disrupted the operation of the Frankfurt Elevated for a period of years, where they had to go into a detour operation around that construction. In 1979, new air-conditioned AM General trackless were placed into service to replace the fleet of earlier tracklesses. In 1986, the Frankfurt Elevated Reconstruction Project began, which was really a large project to rebuild the entire structure. 1999, another new fleet of cars arrived to replace the Bud cars, which had air conditioning. 2001, the Frankfurt Transportation Center began, and that was a major initiative, which we'll talk about later in the program. 2008, new trackless came to replace the AM General coaches. And finally, in 2022, the Frankford Elevated and Route 59 celebrated 100 years of service. So we're going to cover all that tonight, believe it or not. So starting back in 1926, the Delaware River Bridge opened, and you can see on that postcard that there was intended to be trolleys operating over the bridge, as well as rapid transit on the outside of the structure. And even on the picture on the right, you see rails installed across the bridge, which would lead you to believe that trolleys were actually going to be running across the bridge. However, the way it was planned, trolleys were to operate on the outer lanes with the surface lanes on the bridge on each side. Stations were built into each anchorage. A trolley terminal was accommodated under the Franklin Square area, and the Philadelphia anchorage had a passageway for the Frankford Elevated connection. And indeed, the outer rapid transit line track space was included. After the bridge opened, no trolleys operated across the bridge. Track was used for a traveler crane that we saw in that earlier picture, which brought materials to work sites during the construction. Conversion to buses in South Jersey precluded the need for trolleys. The rapid transit route was added in 1936. But I want to get to a very interesting point that was answered by Russ Jackson the other night when he explained, when he had walked through the Franklin Square station in preparations for the Patco project, he saw trolley rail. And the question has always been in my mind, was there trolley rail installed for the trolley system that was intended to come across the bridge? Well, Russ explained what it really was. When they opened up the rapid transit line, it impacted the Route 50 tunnel. The Route 50 tunnel was built to reroute Route 50 underneath the bridge approach on the Philadelphia side. It was a short tunnel and it wasn't that deep. But with the rapid transit line cutting through that tunnel, it had a new tunnel had to be dug adjacent to the old one and deeper and longer. And so that old tunnel got cut off. So Russ said, when you walk through there, you could actually see the old tunnel and the old Route 50 rail. And that's the trolley track that's there that people reference. So it wasn't really as part of the rerouting of trolleys across the bridge from South Jersey. It was just left over from the Route 50 tunnel. I hope that answers some questions. It was a question I've been trying to get answered for some time. The outer trolley space was converted to roadway lanes in 1950, and Patco opened in 1969. And here we are looking south on Front Street, and this is underneath the elevated, and this would have been where that station would have been built if the trolleys were actually placed into service, so that there would be a direct connection from the anchorage on the Philadelphia side to the Frankford Elevated. Again, never happened. So here's what things look like down at Front Market Street before the elevated was built in 1908. And then on the right, you can see how things had changed. And there's a lot of horse-drawn wagons up and down Delaware Avenue at that point. And this is the Pennsylvania Railroad Terminal, which was at the base of Market Street. And that sign in front says, electric trains to Atlantic City. So it must have been a very interesting way to get down the shore before the Delaware River Bridge was built. These two photographs are interesting because the future of the Delaware Avenue Elevated is foreboding or overshadowed by the bridge, that foreboding look where it's starting to take traffic away from the ferries operating across the river, first with automobile traffic and then with rapid transit. On the right, you see the end of the Delaware Avenue Elevated at South Street, and that was opened in 1908. But the impacts are going to be felt from the bridge. First, the cars and buses operated directly into Philadelphia, reducing ferry passenger volume. In 1933, the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines was created, which resulted in the closure of the Reading's Chestnut Street Terminal, ferry terminal on the Philadelphia side. And then finally, in 1936, the new rapid transit line opened across the bridge. Consequently, in 1939, the Delaware Avenue Elevated is retired. So what did that mean? You know, when I gave the program in part one, the true significance of that change was probably not pointed out as clearly as it could have been, but I'm pointing it out tonight because it really is significant. In 1922, the Frankfurt to Delaware Avenue elevated ratio of passenger volume was 4-1. Basically, every other train ran down the Delaware Avenue, and then the other train went up to Frankfurt. So 4-1 ratio in passengers. In 1939, it had increased to 30-1. So obviously, the Frankfurt was growing dramatically, and Delaware Avenue was declining. When it closed the Delaware Avenue Elevated, it meant that 99 round trips were redirected to the Frankfurt Elevated. The peak headway was cut from 4 minutes to 2.5 minutes, and it took 45 trains containing a total of 243 cars to be in full operation on the Market Frankfurt line at that time. So that is really significant, and we'll point out how that impacted other things further on in the program. So there's the Delaware Avenue Elevated being taken down in 1939. And then the bus route F1 was to replace it and providing service to the ferry terminals, which continued to operate until 1952. But you see that that F1 bus is challenged by the freight traffic that ran up and down the Philadelphia Beltline. For those maybe that aren't familiar with the Philadelphia Beltline, it didn't own any cars or locomotives, but it was an asset that the other three major railroads that served Philadelphia could use so that they would have almost universal access to different points along the Philadelphia port on Delaware Avenue. So as I mentioned, the ferry service continued on until 1952. Here's a shot showing that the sharpness of the curve of the Delaware Avenue Elevated off of Front Street and then going down Delaware Avenue was a pretty sharp curve, and it was on a grade. So you were actually climbing out from underneath the subway underneath 2nd Street up onto an elevated right-of-way and then curving to go down Delaware Avenue. I mean, it's almost like an amusement ride. So moving forward, there were changes to the Frankfurt Elevated. In 1942, there were wartime adjustments. Erie-Tarsdale turnbacks had to be implemented to address substation capacity limitations. Again, when it was originally built, it wasn't intended that all the trips would go to Frankfurt. In 1948, a new terminal opened at Arrett Street, and we'll talk about that in detail. In 1952, the new lateral platform at Bridge Street opened up. Again, this is an outgrowth of the passenger growth that occurred. You have a huge volume of passengers now using these facilities, which weren't designed or built to handle it. So they had to start making modifications to increase the capacity. One by adding a platform at Bridge Street, later by adding an escalator at Bridge Street. In 1956, a new bus depot opened up at Frankfurt, and it was part of a 1,001 new buses purchased to replace a lot of the rail facilities, unfortunately. And then in 1960, 270 new L cars were delivered by the bike company to replace 315 older cars. And you're going to see a pattern here as the fleet size starts to decline. So the World War II service adjustments. Here's a PTC coming out and admitting that the extension of service up to Bridge Street is taxing our electric power facilities. Therefore, we're going to be turning every other train back at Erie-Tarsdale. And this is during the war, so they're being probably pressed to run as much service as they possibly can to get employees up to the Frankfurt Arsenal. And one other factor is the restoration of Route 73 trolley service. It had been discontinued on August 30th, 1941, but by June 23rd, it was placed back into service in 1943. How could that be done so quickly? Well, the rail and the overhead that the 73 was using was already in service as a pull-out route for Route 15, where the cars came from Frankford Depot down to a terminal at Bridge and Milner. Route 15 also did serve the Frankfurt Arsenal at Bridge and Milner, and it operated with Frankfurt with PCC cars. On April 10th of 1948, Route 73 got converted back to bus, and Route 15 eventually got cut back to Richmond and Allegheny. This is all post-war. And I want to relay a story about this loop because it really has some significance to me because it was mentioned in the introduction. I eventually got out of a bus driver's position and then got into scheduling. Well, I reported for work one day, and the dispatcher handed me a note, and he says, did you see this note? And I had just come back from vacation, and I said, no, I didn't. He says, well, Human Resources have been trying to call you. I don't know what it was called. It was probably personnel back then. But anyway, I got the note. I did the half trip down to Richmond and Westmoreland, and 73 jumped into the phone booth, called them up, and said, "Hey, what I'm here, and what do you need?" And they said basically, "Well, this is great. We were just about to give up on you. We've been trying to reach you, and it's been over a week since we started to reach out to you, but we want to offer you a job." And so that's always been, I always get reminded about that when I'm at Richmond and Westmoreland. Moving on, we see the new platform being built in 1952 up at Bridge Street. And this allowed trains to be able to discharge passengers quickly to the right while other passengers boarded from the center platform. Sometimes trains turned on the platform. Sometimes I'm told that they moved beyond here to turn in a crossover, but they were taxed to get the trains in and out of here during peak period. So the addition of that platform helped in the passenger movement. Here you can see that at one time, Bridge Street was a very active trolley terminal for routes 3, 5, and 66. 66 went around a loop. We'll talk about that in a second. Here's a Route 3 car positioned on Frankford Avenue underneath the elevated. And this is one of those images that came from the Frankfurt Historical Society. I love the detail there. And I believe all this information on the left is accurate. Please let me know if I've misstated anything. Here's some color views of streetcars up in at the Bridge Street terminal end. If somebody, I can't make out those flags. I was wondering if anybody would know the significance of those flags on the PCC car 2170. But it seemed like these were all shot near the same period with a lot of snow on the ground still. And then as we mentioned earlier, the ferry service ended altogether on March 31st, 1952. And there's everybody waving goodbye to the last ferry leaving for Camden. So trolley feeder routes converted to rubber tires. Not a popular subject matter, I'm sure. But unfortunately, it did occur. 9 routes were converted to rubber-tired vehicles in 8 years. The red highlighting or numbers indicate the 5 were done in 2 years. So in 1955 and 56, there was a lot of conversion from rail to first bus, and in some cases to trackless. And there it is. There's the Frankfurt Trolley Depot. And these are taken from a PTC brochure. That's why they're not as high quality as maybe some of the other images, but they tell the story as they were telling it. And there's your streetcars on the left, and then there's your 1,001 new GMC buses everywhere. and they all look the same. They were different, but they all look the same with that paint scheme. I'm not sure everyone understands why 1,001 buses were purchased, but there was a situation where a bus was operated on Route A. I believe it was on Henry Avenue or close to 30th and Allegheny where it caught fire. I believe that bus number was 3600 and it was replaced with 3850. So that's why there's 1,001 GMC buses. Here are the rail routes that operated out of Frankfurt. And of course, the Hop-Toed Frog had two routes, one that went up Frankfurt Avenue and the other one that went up Tacony Street and State Road. When PRTC took that over, the Frankfurt Avenue rail operation was continued, and that became Route 66. The Tacony Street route became Bus Route T. Again, another capacity increase to move passengers through the terminal more proficiently, with a new escalator being added up at the Bridge Street in 1956. And then, of course, the cars. The cars are getting long in the tooth, and of course, the Market Street cars were even older, so you need a new fleet of cars. But the Frankfurt cars were apparently good enough to be held and retained for use as the revenue train. The two numbers in red indicate the two cars used on the revenue train, and three others were used in general work train service. But here comes the new fleet of cars coming down from the red line plan of the Bud Company. This is coming down at Welsh Road in Bustleton on a flatbed. And here comes what is known as the Almond Joy cars for some fans. And they were well received. There was a big ceremony up at the Bridge and Pratt. You had now 270 cars. Before you had 315. Now you have 270 new cars. The photo on the right has been referred to as the way people dressed back in the day. And I always like to challenge that because this was a publicity photo when the cars were new and they wanted to promote the cars. So these people are dressed to the nines, but not as everyday commuters. Here's the ceremony up at Bridge Street. There's Mayor Richardson Dilworth, who is a mass transit and service advocate. He worked to salvage some of the commuter rail lines in 1958 with the operations program. He also had a lot of initiatives on the transit side, including these new cars. So he was a great mayor to push for mass transit. There's a new lightweight truck design, which unfortunately is going to lead to problems because the car flew off the track down in York Street in 1961. There was a derailment, and at that point, apparently they did not have speed signals in place. And so the buses had to come to the rescue and save the commuters from the disruption. So let's talk about Route 59 for a minute. Route 59 was intended to be built from Frankfurt through Bustleton all the way up to Bybury at Southampton and the Boulevard. Just like the Frankford Elevated, it had limited funding because of the war effort, the price of steel that impacted the construction of the Elevated, and that affected the city's funding for the total project. So it was opened in 1922. Only the first segment was built to Lot Street, a distance of about 6 miles. They had 5 Bernie cars, which sat 33 passengers each, as I had mentioned earlier, and it had limited double track. It was intended to be built as a high-capacity double track line for its entire length, but of course that did not happen. So, passenger growth. It almost occurred immediately, but in 1928, the larger double-ended PRT cars fully replaced those Bernies. They were supplementing the Bernie cars almost from the beginning. I've been told by Andy McGinnis that might have occurred as early as 1923. Double track and sidings had to be added to increase frequency to provide capacity for the demand. In 1942, double tracking was constructed through Oxford Circle. Prior to that time, Route 59 had to be squeezed into a single track around the northern end of the circle, which I'm sure was constraining as far as the operating closer headways. In 1948, the Arrett Street Terminal Loop was instituted, but the route was cut back to Cotman Avenue from Bustleton, and that was to allow construction work to occur on Castor Avenue for widening, and then in preparation for the new trackless to be placed in service in 1950. PTC spent $1 million on Arrett Street back in 1948. That's a significant amount of money back then for a transit agency, private transit agency, to improve its operations. In 1950, trackless trolleys were finally introduced on Route 59, and the line was extended up to Bell's Corner over the widened Castor Avenue. So here we are up at Lott Street, the terminal, and there's your Bernie car sitting there with the 33 passengers. That's car number 4. By 1928, they had all been replaced by larger double-ended cars, increasing seating capacity by 50%, and even more so when you added standees. I never saw a color photograph of the Bernie cars when they were painted in this paint scheme. So I stumbled upon this William Volkbeer shot. I thought I would include that tonight because I know most of these photographs are black and white. Here's the 1942 extension of double track through Oxford Circle, which increased capacity significantly. And here on the right is a car that's been, it's parked at the new terminal now at Cotman Avenue, while that period of time when Castor Avenue was being widened and the route was going to be re-extended back up. But until that was completed, the trolley route was terminated at Cotman Avenue. To commemorate the last day of rail operation into Bustleton, the NRHS chartered a fan trip. The picture on the left is a previous charter, but it is the same car, and it's a great picture of the car, so that's why I included it tonight. On the right is an interesting situation. In the red circle, that car is off the track. It derailed, and it's got the line tied up. There's 4 line cars tied up here trying to get past it for the last day of operation for this charter. And there it is going over the Pennypack Bridge. So the Arrett Street Terminal. And again, this is another one of those things that you touch on in your reading, and you start to realize after $1 million, $1 million is being spent. What was bought for $1 million, and it was significant. Arrett Street and Orthodox Street had changed the directions from Castor Avenue all the way through to Richmond Street. Route 75 was converted from rail to trackless in 1948. 25 new Brill-built TC-44 coaches were acquired for Route 75. Bus routes J and K, which were operating out of a terminal on Overington Street, were shifted over to the new terminal at Arrett Street. New loading platforms were built adjacent to the substations and on Arrett Street. And a Route 59 route was established. Route 59 used to come down Oxford Avenue and stop and reverse and go back to Bustleton. But since the street direction had been changed on Arrett Street, the 59 cars could now loop through the terminal. And so the city of Philadelphia invested in adding new track to allow a loop to function for a 2-year period when the trolleys were operating and before trackless were placed into service in 1950. So between 1948 and 1950, that rail was used, but not afterward. Here are the streets in their previous direction, with Arrett Street being eastbound and Orthodox Street being westbound. And here's a couple of views of Arrett Street in the eastbound operation. There's a Route 75 car waiting to board passengers heading for Richmond and Margaret Street, I guess, or Orthodox, I guess, eventually. And then on the right, you see there's the dummy depot that was built in 1878, I believe. And behind it is the remnants of the 1858 horse car barn that quickly got converted over to dummy, steam dummy operation. So it was still there in 1912. And in between those two are the substation that was built for trolleys. Here's another view of 75 operating eastbound, but this time it's underneath the Frankfurt branch of the Reading Company. We talked about that in part one. That was the Philadelphia and Frankfurt Railroad, initially in 1894. And just to the right of the trolley, and then up past the bridge, there was this station called Arrett Street. Now, when the elevated first opened up, it really had a devastating impact on the commuter service that was offered by the Reading at this location. The Reading was actually operating every 30 minutes all day long, and it took about 30 minutes to get downtown. That's like Chestnut Hill, commuter service levels. And, they would have probably still been operating if the Frankford Elevated wasn't built. That's just my speculation. But, they did continue to operate train service out of this station for quite some time afterwards. The main station on Frankfurt Avenue was closed in 1928, but the service was maintained here. And the reason for that was it was tied into a cycle that delivered cars to the Sears warehouse on the boulevard. They had a huge mail order business that was picking up. The train would bring empties up in the morning and then turn at Arrett Street here and then provide inbound commuter service. It was one trip a day. In the evening, it was a very unusual operation, and I won't get into that right now, but this operation went on for some time, even after the Frankfurt Elevated had been opened. Of course, we have to say farewell to the 75 as a rail operation. So here's the Bernie car passing through the new terminal now. It's ready to go into service, and I guess the street direction hadn't been reversed yet. And on 75, there was a small section of private right-of-way operation between, I want to say, Castor and Wyoming Avenue. And it was through this area. But when the line got converted to trackless, the trackless used city streets, and this right-of-way was discontinued. It was unused. And the city of Philadelphia later came back and dedicated it as a public street and called it Ramona Avenue. But that wasn't done overnight. It took a few years, I believe, for that to happen. So here we are. Here's Route 75 ready to go in service. There's the new Brill trackless lined up on Castor Avenue. Of course, Castor Avenue is now going to be served by this route change, so that's a positive thing. All the bunting is on these new coaches. So that's a big change that's going to happen. Now, the picture on the right is something that I like to point out. We talk about truth in journalism, and it's a big challenge even today. But here it is back in 1948, and here's a lineup of coaches that are sitting on the street in the snowstorm. And the caption reads, for those of you who may not be able to read it, it says, "Halted by storm, Route 75 trackless sitting abandoned east of Frankfurt Avenue on Margaret Street." Well, by the time the trackless were introduced, the street directions had been changed. So they're not sitting on Margaret Street at all. They're on Orthodox Street. And what they're doing is they're waiting for passengers to transfer off of the L going overhead. So you can't always believe what you read in the newspapers. Here's the Overington Street Terminal. Congested as it was, there were three routes here, J, K, and P. The J and the K got moved over to the Arrett Street Transportation Center in 1948. The P remained here, as you can see on the picture on the right, and that's one of the small buses that operated in PTC era, and they were called Crockett's. Why were they called Crockett's? Well, some of them were bought from different parts down south. I forget the actual city that they refer to for Davy Crockett, but they refer to the whole bunch as Crockett's. And this one in particular was built for Tulsa, and as number, it was a TDH 3610. I have the number if anybody needs it. So here's the Arrett Street Terminal as it was conceived. This is another picture from that brochure from PTC. There's your buses lined up adjacent to the substation with a new loading platform. There's the other new loading platform along Arrett Street. And so 75 is coming through. The T and the J are over there. And then Route 59 can spin around from Oxford. And here it is on the right. And you can see there it is about to turn on Penn Street. Well, there was no track on Penn Street until 1948. The city funded the installation of that so that Route 59 could be looped in here for that 2-year period. You can also notice that the car is using the positive wire for the trackless overhead. Here's another view of Arrett Street Transportation. Well, it became Arrett Street Transportation, Arrett Terminal. And we have a Hug Island car are now operating on Route 59. These 4-motor cars drew a lot of power, and I think the only way they could have been operated on 59 is after the truncation of the route at Cotman Avenue. There was always a need for power on this route. In fact, when the trackless went into service, a new substation was placed at Bell's Corner. Route J is loading on the other side. Route J has been redesignated now, so there's no J bus anymore. It's Route 41. Here's the loop that I was talking about, and that stretch on Penn Street was new rail that was funded by the city of Philadelphia for the loop operation for Route 59 for that 2-year period. This is just a recent view, and you can see what the terminal looks like. That's a Route K, and the future of Route K is interesting. It hasn't been redesignated yet, so we have to wait and see what SEPTA has in for Route K. Here's the brochure that was issued to promote the conversion over to trackless in 1950. They bought TC-46s from Marmon Harrington. I believe there were 28 coaches acquired. And the red circle highlights that portion of Castor Avenue that was widened to accommodate more traffic and the extension of trackless up to Bell's Corner. Of course, whenever a major event like this occurs, everybody has to come out and cut a ribbon, get their picture taken. I don't know who these people are. I'm sure some of them are probably significantly contributed to this endeavor, but there's a lot of people there. The coaches got delivered early because of the construction that was going on Castor Avenue. Some of the coaches were sent to Southern. That's where Coach 481 is in that upper left-hand picture. So they were stored for a period of time, and you can see they were clearly lettered City of Philadelphia. And then there's a picture of it after it went into service up at Bell's Corner with a somewhat Art Deco terminal building, shelter with operator's waiting room. It looks pretty futuristic. I think we're going to see that again in the future. So here's a very interesting situation. Because Route 75 was a trackless route operating from over from Richmond Street, Bridesburg, it used the same wire going through the Arrett Transportation Center. So if you were approaching the coach from behind, unless you knew one was a Brill and one was a Marmon, and not everybody did, you had a situation where people would be running from the L trying to catch their coach. Well, somebody got the smart idea to put 59 on the back corner of the city coaches so that they would differentiate between the Route 75s and the 59. That was pretty smart. That lasted until April of 1966 when Route 75 was cut back because of I-95 construction going through Bridesburg. The trackless operation beyond the Arrett Street terminal was discontinued. This actually is a last trip operating. It's a Mitch Libby provided photograph, and this is at a cutback on Edmond Streets. I believe the rail, when it was operating as a rail route, it also had a cutback here. I have to confirm that, but there are a lot of poles in that street on Edmond. Of course, when 75 got cut back, Route J was extended over to Richmond Street, and that, of course, has been redesignated Route 41. So now we're going to talk about 66, like I promised. In 1926, the Hop, Toad, and Frog was taken over by the PRTC. Route 66 began on January 2nd. Large double-ended PRTC 52 and 5300 cars were assigned. In 1927, they moved the route off of city streets, which is where it terminated on Frankford Avenue and Bridge Street. They moved it into the terminal using a loop. In 1945, Gregg Street Loop opened, but without a substation. In 1955, buses replaced the streetcars for overhead modification, and by September 11, 1955, trackless trolleys began service, and the loop was reversed. So here's the Hop, Toad, and Frog. Remember when it used to snow like this? Maybe it'll cool us off in some of these hot summer days. Well, that's a Hop, Toad, and Frog car, and it really didn't look like it was positioned to handle the loads that would develop on Frankford Avenue on Route 66. It was a little operation. That's the type of car that used to run. This is on Ron Street, on the other route that ran down State and Tacony Street. And I'm going to ask for help here because this car is still bugging me. Car number 119 now is, I found it in the Brill promotional brochure booklet. There it is, lettered for the Hop, Toad, and Frog, Frankfurt, Tacony, and Holmesburg. But every roster I've been able to uncover for this little operation never had a car of that size with that number. There's more promotional pictures of the car and the interior and then the seating arrangement. I just, I don't know why it was lettered for the Frankfurt, Tacony, and Holmesburg, but I'm sure somebody knows. I'm all ears. So here's the two routes that the Hop, Toad, and Frog operated. Frankfurt Avenue was Route 66, and the one on Tacony Street and State Road became a bus route designated as Route T. Here's the loop for 66, and it's coming into off of Bridge Street at this point, and this was like a conveyor belt. I mean, it was high capacity. There were cars loading and going in the peak periods, and it actually, the way the loop was configured, it began to be a traffic consideration. It blocked traffic on Frankfurt Avenue for blocks while these cars exited the terminal. The route was 6.1 miles long, and as you can see on that map, maybe you can't, but Ron Street is about halfway. So that would have been a rapid transit line as far as Ron Street if the full Frankfurt L plan was built. Here's how those cars loaded and go. I mean, both doors were open. They had a loader at the back, and you just collect the transfers, get that car full, pack them in, and let them go. Bring the next car down. This is in the PM rush hour. It was, you had to see it to believe it. Now, on the upper end is where the reason for the double-ended cars is realized, because down at the Bridge Street end they had the loop, but up here it was a stub end terminal, and there's 5284 laying over for its next trip inbound from Andalusia, and there's a Neubauer bus waiting for passengers to transfer over for trips going up into Bucks County. But of course, the 66 had its last day, and here's the last car operating, commemorating rail service on Route 66. It was a charter. I keep bumping into people that were on that car. I said, "Can you see yourself?" Nah, not really. So it got a temporary conversion over to bus, which started almost immediate. Well, it started immediately. The busing lasted until September 10th, and then on September 11th, 1955, it went trackless. And they went back to Marmon-Harrington with larger coaches, TC-49s, you can see in the lower right. And it really, they needed double doors to load these passengers and get them out. And I think they were struggling to match the capacity of the trolley line. Here's the loop that was changed. It used to be a clockwise direction, and it was reversed into an counterclockwise direction, and then redirected up Bustleton to Cheltenham Avenue. And then it could turn left onto Frankfurt at a signalized intersection instead of just kind of coming out of the terminal. Even, I believe today, when they come out of the terminal, all kinds of bells and lights start flashing so that pedestrians aren't impacted. So here's an interesting photograph. Here's Coach 325, which was the test bed for the chopper control. That's sitting up at the Andalusia Loop. And then there's the new AM Generals that replaced the Marmons. And they did include the chopper control, but there was not a smooth transition over to the new coaches. You know, the Frankford L did not run every day. There were interruptions when the contract expired for the TWU, and then everybody had to seek alternate means. Here they are waiting at Frankfurt Junction for the next inbound Trenton local. And you can tell that the facilities weren't really set up to handle that volume of people. There was really no platform. They're actually boarding the train off of an active rail bed. Unbelievable. But it only happened once every 2 years, and you never knew how many days it would be. So the picture on the left is actually a SEPTA photograph. All those buses are marked for SEPTA. They have stickers over the PTC wings, even though they're all green. And SEPTA was created in '64. It was intended to take over PTC. That occurred in 1968. And then eventually SEPTA started rebuilding the older fleet. The bus on the right was a Frankfurt bus. I probably did drive that bus. It was rebuilt by NIMCO. There were three initiatives to rebuild this fleet. The other rebuilder was Blitz. And then a number of the buses were rebuilt in-house at Wyoming Avenue. So in 1976, we had a major change in the routing of the Frankford Elevated. I-95 construction again impacts the operation by constructing the northbound lanes up Front Street. So the L had to move. So they built a temporary structure, and you can see in the picture on the right, the old structure is still in service, and the new right-of-way is being tested. There's a two-car train down there to test power and signals. But this involved the closure of Fairmount Station on Front Street and the opening of Spring Garden Station in between the north and southbound lanes of 95. So there's an attractive transit alternative to go up there and wait for a train while listening to the roar of traffic on, let's just say, 8 lanes, 4 on each side. It's a wonderful experience. So in 1979, air conditioning comes to the trolley coach fleet. AM General delivered 110 new coaches. 10 came with wheelchair lifts, And these were a difficult transition, but the air conditioning was welcomed by the passengers. And then the Frankford Elevated reconstruction project. Well, this was interesting because the logic was that the Market Street side would have to be replaced first, but that wasn't the case. They found that the Frankford end was in much worse shape and needed to be addressed first. So the Frankfurt Elevated reconstruction project was developed. It was a 10-year project. It cost $760 million to rebuild the 5.2-mile-long elevated. It used concrete precast deck, but the banks, the support structure from the ground up to the decks was reusable, which is a wonderful thing because if you understood how much steel is below the street, supporting those banks, you'd be amazed. And we actually covered that in the Part 1 program. They used direct fixation of track, and the station replacement effort was also undertaken, except for Tioga. Tioga was retained pretty much the way it is back in 1922. And this is a photo that I took one Sunday morning in Harrogate Park. I parked on Kensington Avenue. I walked 10 feet to get this shot. I really wanted to get, go into the park and get a much more similar shot to the one on the left. But in that 10 feet, I met a Doberman pinscher. I got propositioned, and I saw a drug deal go down. So I was happy to get back in my car and drive home. Actually, Sherelle Parker's done an amazing job, and I think things are much better now. But that was an interesting experience for me on a Sunday morning. Air conditioning. Well, there were a number of these cars that were set up to be modified to have air conditioning installed at a later date. Only one was done. And I don't know what's the community say. Is this still an Almond Joy car since the humps are gone? My car 614 ran for many years as the sole air-conditioned car. But finally, air conditioning did come with a new fleet of cars in 1999 built by Agtrans. And there's a Bob Wright photograph on the right showing the brand new cars on display. And these cars were a godsend. Unfortunately, they're not going to last as long as most other fleets in Philadelphia. But they came with air conditioning, soundproofing, auto-visual announcements for the next station, external announcements. Regenerative braking was introduced with these cars. There were 222 cars ordered with wider doorways and 48 less cars than the Bug cars, because we're down from 270 now. However, these two cars, there seems to be some confusion about those two cars. It is my understanding that two cars were purchased for the revenue train, and they were never delivered as part of the liquidated damage settlement on the delivery of the cars. Correct me if I'm wrong. The AC propulsion and traction control was also included in these cars. There's a fact sheet that kind of shows many of the details of the car. One is that they accelerated at a rate of 3 miles per hour per second, which is pretty fast. And I've been on them and gotten thrown without holding on. You can lose your balance real quick. What happened to the Almond Joy Bud cars? Well, at the time that they were being retired, the Philadelphia and Western, Norristown High Speed Line, Route 100, Route M, whatever the current designation is for this route, they were suffering from available cars. The brills were starting to get long in the tooth, so they needed a quick substitute. So a number of the L cars were moved over to operate on that line. But as we know, this line is standard gauge track, and the Frankfurt line was pretty much Pennsylvania wide gauge within a quarter inch. So they had to get trucks from some other location. And here, Path was retiring these 1958 St. Louis built cars which had trucks that were compatible with the Market Frankfurt cars, and that's how they solved the solution. And finally, we have the Frankfurt Transportation Center project. Now, this was a significant undertaking. It was one of the largest capital projects undertaken at the time by SEPTA, and it involved many, many, many changes to the area. The problem with the terminal up there was that everything evolved over time. There was never a plan on how things should operate. I mean, it just grew and grew and grew, and there was never a well thought out operating system for the movement of passengers, the movement of vehicles, parking. It was a mess. I mean, when I was a driver and you were in the bay at Frankfurt Depot, and you were trying to pull out, say, to the stand to board passengers for Route 88, you had to walk, I had to move that vehicle through a sea of people that were running back and forth constantly to make a connection. And you just, you almost could inch, you just inched and inched, and if people bumped into the bus, or whatever it was, you just kind of got to the stand in a very slow fashion, boarded, and then went. That had to be addressed. And so this project, it did that. It created accessible covered pathways for transferring passengers. It eliminated the conflicts between transit vehicles and pedestrians. It also addressed parking because parking was a nightmare there. There was a conflict between operators trying to park to go to work, people who lived there parking, and then, of course, commuters. So the new parking deck added 1,000 new parking spaces. There was a new off-street parking lot created for employees. And then some on-street parking was eliminated to improve the flow of transit vehicles. And what a change. What a dramatic change. Here's the view in 1948 underneath the elevated on Frankfurt Avenue. And on the right is the same location with everything being relocated onto SEPTA property and Frankfurt Avenue being open to the sky. Here's the Hammonds building. This is a view that no one ever saw because the elevated structure was in front of it. And now it's been renovated. It is a police headquarters, a district police office, and it's the boarding area for passengers to get onto the L line. And of course, on the right is the 1,000 space parking deck. And then in 2008, we finally got a new fleet of coaches that were interestingly dual mode. And what does that mean? Well, they come with small diesel engines in the back, and that's a godsend for a trackless route because if there's a fire or a detour, you can operate short distances off wire and maintain service. It turns out that this feature has been employed for the pullouts between the depot and our terminal, Arrett Street Transportation Center, because the overhead underneath the elevated structure is damaged frequently by trucks. So they no longer use that wire. They use the diesel engine to pull out and pull in. And so, how far we've come. We do have this new fleet of cars operating, and we're going to be addressing that shortly. There's a new fleet of coaches that's been delivered, and it's a much more improved transportation asset, and hopefully it will be funded in the future 100%. So we made it. I thank you very much for your attention tonight. I hope I didn't editorialize too much. Just to finish up, here's a couple of then and now photographs. This is Lehigh Avenue, back when Route 4 was coming down Kensington Avenue, about to turn right onto Lehigh. It pretty much looks the same today, except for the Reading YMCA has been replaced with a U-Haul storage center, and the Strathman Lumber Building seems to still be there, but maybe not active as a lumber company. Here's up at the Arrett Street Terminal again. This is fully accessible with elevators for wheelchair passengers. and level boarding for all passengers. And there's a photograph of the Hog Island car ready to depart up in around 1948, 49. Up at Bell's Corner, remember that futuristic looking shelter, passenger shelter back in 1950? Well, there it is in 2024, and it looks pretty good with that tile background. Fits right in. Looks like a modern facility. Here's the trolley, 59 trolley up in Bustleton with the Bernie car, and now it's a modern air-conditioned dual-mode trackless operating out of Bell's Corner. Here's a single truck car sitting in the middle of Frankford Avenue, which you couldn't see happening today, and there's a modern bus coming down with Cedar Hill Cemetery in the background. And here's the difference in the Andalusia Loop. There's the Route 66 and Neatbauer bus. It's been replaced with a full terminal area for the trackless. And 75, well, there's 75 with the new coaches about to go into service on Castor Avenue. And over on the right, you see the new labor point at the Wayne Junction station. It's been fully renovated. It's fully accessible. And I think we've come a very long way with that asset. For the fleet, there's the Frankfurt cars operating, and we've got the Adtran cars. There's the Frankfurt Transportation Center in the left of that photograph. That's a picture taken by Kevin Painter from the parking deck of the hospital, I believe. And now we have new cars coming. SEPTA's new Hitachi M5 cars are under contract. We're going to get 200 cars. Notice the number keeps declining, but there is a 40-car option. Delivery is expected in 2029 through 2031. The cost is $724 million. It's going to have open gangways, which is a European feature that if you've traveled over in the UK or some of the other light rail systems, that'll be interesting. Certainly more secure. If police officers are in one car, they can look through the train into other cars. It'll have longitudinal seating, so that the capacity will be greatly increased. Hopefully, it will have regenerative braking, but Adtran cars already had that, so that's not a big selling point, but it's good that they're going to have that. And then auto door operation, which I'm not sure what that means. I guess it doesn't. It means that they'll have sensors. We'll have to wait and see. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation tonight. I hope we covered a lot of points that you may or may have not known about, and if there are any questions, I'll certainly be glad to answer them. But before I do, I want to remind you that we do have this book for sale for the benefit of the Frankfurt Historical Society for an amount of $25. But again, it includes a lot of different photographs and information that explains a lot of what I tried to cover tonight in this brief presentation, and part one as well. So please consider that. For you people online, this is the website, and I believe Kristen is going to share that with you as well. So thank you, and if you have any questions, please ask.
Thank you so much, Harry. Fascinating. Already lots of nice comments coming in. And if you'd like an easy to click link to get that book, I did just put that in the chat box. So you can click on that. It'll open up the tab and you can look at it after we finish up here. Before we get to questions, I did want to announce what is coming up next here. So hold on to your hats. We've got Pittsburgh Railways, A Brief History from George Gula coming up on September 23rd. That'll be our next Trolleyology. And we also will have part 2 of our Patco presentation from Bob Wright at some point this fall. And hopefully some other presenters will send me an email wanting to present something soon. Awesome. So thank you very much, Harry. If you would like to support the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, you can go to patrolley.org/support. Let's see. Let me get to, actually, there were not many questions that came in during the chat, but there was some nice commentary. Let's see. Yes, very fine presentation. There was some comments. The Market Street L was beefier than the Frankfurt L. Let's see. Comment that the M4s aren't as roomy as the Almond Joys.
Okay.
Let me set it so that folks can unmute here if they have any comments. Let's see. Okay, participants should be able to unmute themselves. Does anyone have a question or comment for Harry? I don't think we got any answers to your that car that you had in there. Nobody jumped in with any further insight there.
The Frankfurt Taconian Holmesburg car.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to really track that down because there's definitely a lot of information from Brill that they built the car and it existed. There's physical photographs of the car itself, so it just seems to be a very large car for that little operation.
Sure thing. George, you've unmuted. Did you have a comment?
No, I'm just sitting here.
Oh, okay.
So I would say in terms of throughout 66 and 75, now I was told by several SEPTA employees, at least in the trolley era, 66 always had lousy power. And
They did. I had to add a substation up at the Greg Street Loop. I don't know when that was added, but that was a factor that had to be addressed.
Now, as far as 75 going over to east, east of Frankford Avenue, there was allegedly power problems on that too. Somebody in SEPTA and somebody way back in PTC said that in part they were using the old 75 trolley track as part of the power distribution system, and that wasn't very good.
No, as a return. Yeah, that I've heard different things about that, and it's kind of interesting because even if you go today, you can see where a power distribution cable from the substation at Arrett Street was run down to 56 along Orthodox Street. Those poles are still there. But I guess there wasn't a substation over on the eastern end, and but I know that the I-95 construction is what really cut the route back.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Harry, on your car that you don't know about, I would suggest it was built on speculation. They wanted to put a name on it, so they picked the name of a railroad that would never own the car and put it on. So it was most probably a photo thing, and then they sold the car to somebody else along the way just to make it look like it was an order.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
One of those cars actually looked more like a near side. I mean,
The 119, the one that had the letter for Frankfurt, Tacony, and Holmesburg.
Seemed to be, yeah. The other definitely double-ended.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Harry? We've got one in the chat from Fred who says, my two sets of grandparents lived on opposite directions of the 75 and one aunt uncle lived out on the 59. And we didn't have a car until 1960. So we rode the L and the trackless a lot.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, I grew up without a car in my family. So yeah, we would buses, trolleys, trackless, and trains everywhere.
Question from Paul. Other than the railroads, was everything in Philly 600 volts DC?
My understanding, it was.
Kristen, if I can interrupt, Art Ellis told me that the P&W was 750 until they merged with the actual Red Arrow streetcar system, and then everything was dropped down to the 600.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe further research is needed.
Yes. Well, that would have been a John Calnan question during the P&W presentation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've had lots of Philadelphia area presentations this year, so thank you all. There's
Nothing wrong with that.
Lots to talk about in that part of the world, huh? Let's see. Any other questions or comments for Harry?
Nope, but a question of you.
Oh,
You were
okay.
going to do a thing on the terrible trolley. Did I miss it, or is it still in the works?
So Terrible Trolley has rolled out. I'm hoping to get our project manager, the restoration manager, Michael, to do a presentation on all the different nifty bits and pieces that, just like tell the story of the restoration, because there's lots of fun nuts and bolts around that. But I don't have a date for that, but hopefully we will.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Anything else for Harry? Awesome. Well, we will get this presentation up on YouTube within the next couple months here. I'm kind of behind. I think I'm up to through May, so not too far behind, but sorry about that. I'll get them up here shortly. We've had a very busy week here at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. We carried almost 7,000 people during the Washington County Fair. We do a park and ride shuttle. So along with the Terrible Trolley rollout last Tuesday, we also had 7,000 people almost riding at the museum. And we had our former executive director's retirement party on Sunday. So now that all of that's over, hopefully I'll be able to get back to adding some of this to YouTube. So Harry, thank you very much for presenting tonight. You're welcome back anytime. And we will hopefully see all of you guys at the next one next month on September 23rd. Thanks again to those of you who donated. We'll see you again soon. Have a great night.
You as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Harry.
Anytime, George. In fact, George, I'd like to give you a call sometime. I have your number and I have some questions for you on another subject.
Sounds like a fun discussion.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.